Welcome back to the Piping Pastor, Theology Talks. Today we'll be concluding our discussion of theological anthropology by taking a last look at divine action through the traditions of China. Well, as I mentioned in my last video, it can sometimes be difficult for us to conceptualize spiritual action on physical matter, because in many of our Western traditions, physical and non-physical or spiritual are usually separate things. When we look at the religio-philosophic traditions of China, specifically Neo-Confucian Qi cosmology and Taoism, we're afforded a look of reality where the physical and non-physical are fully enmeshed. And for this rather weighty discussion, I am smoking my Balkan mixture in my Boswell pipe. So, as I mentioned, the separation of physical and non-physical or spiritual in the West is rather prevalent. It's referred to as substance dualism, the idea of our soul or our spiritual nature residing in our physical bodies, and then when our physical bodies die, our spirit kind of ascends to heaven. That's kind of the general idea. Now, the difficulty with that from the Christian theological perspective is that we are meant to have glorified bodies in heaven. And when Christ, as incarnate God, revisited after ascending to heaven, Christ returned in a physical body, maintaining the wounds that were, of course, inflicted upon him on the cross. And of course, we have the entire story of the doubting Thomas and so on and so forth. And we have images of Christ eating with the disciples after returning, after the ascension. And what that all means for us in a salvific sense, we'll discuss in soteriology, which will hopefully only be one or two videos. I know we've gone rather a bit long with the discussion of theological anthropology and creationism, but I think it's helpful to have a grounding in that when we move forward into the other more spiritually heavy aspects of theology, such as salvation, pneumatology, and so on and so forth. Because the physical and spiritual have to kind of be together, right? Which is, of course, very prevalent in creationism and theological anthropology, where we're discussing the creation of the universe, the physical universe, and, of course, the progression of humanity throughout evolution, right? There has to be spiritual action on physical matter in order for us to be formed, as I use the analogy of the clay figurine. But again, if we operate from the perspective of substance dualism or spiritual and physical being two separate things, then that can be hard. Because when the spirit then comes into contact with the physical, we have something that's referred to in theology as the causal joint. The problem of the causal joint. Where does the finger of God touch the human heart, right? Happily, we have revelation and we have knowledge through other traditions as well. And specifically in the traditions of China. The separation of religion, science, philosophy that we see in the West as separate disciplines, separate areas of study, didn't exist in China until the arrival of the Jesuit missionaries in the 17th century. The Jesuit missionaries showed up, very educated priests, very, very knowledgeable, and they began to encounter the intelligentsia of China, those who were the educated Confucian scholars. And they were like, okay, well, let's talk about your philosophy. Let's talk about your astronomy, your mathematics. Let's talk about your religion. And they were like, what? And the Chinese scholars were like, well, that's all the same thing, right? It's all together. And then the Jesuit missionaries were like, no, we have to have these separate categories, right? We can talk about philosophy, we can talk about religion or theology, and we can talk about science and math and so forth, but they have to be in their own lanes. So that's where we got the separation between Li Shu and Zhongzhao and Imixing, which is superstition from the Jesuits' perspective. Happily, the concepts that existed survive today. Now, the most obvious, of course, is yin yang. But even the depiction that we have of yin yang, you've probably seen it in 1,000 different posters and tattoos and the light and the dark, masculine, feminine, black and white. as two different convergent things with a little bit of each one, right? In each one. That's not, strictly speaking, accurate. You see, in order to have a proper depiction of yin yang, it wouldn't be like black and white, so starkly divided. It would be more like a gray circle because everything is fully enmeshed. Um, the spirit and the flesh are together. When I've traveled around and done various different talks, because this is part of my area of research, chi within the human body. When I've done talks in the West and in Europe and the United States and so on and so forth, and I've discussed chi, um, I have to preface it by saying, chi is both physical and non-physical. It's and then I'd soon use about 20 minutes describing what that means. When I do talks in China, I've done talks in Hong Kong and Taiwan and in China and so forth. The Chinese scholars I engage with, um, especially the Neo-Confucian Qi cosmologists that I've worked with in the past, they always been the discussion by pointing out, you're not going to say that Qi is just non-physical, are you? And I say, no, of course not. It's physical and non-physical. Okay, because they're assuming that I come, with that preconceived notion that Qi is just a non-physical thing, that it's just like a, for lack of a better term, a spiritual thing. They don't really view it as a spiritual thing. It's just an aspect of reality, but it is both physical and non-physical. The concepts exist together, which, when we look at it from a Christian theological view, that makes the most sense for us as well. That we are not three separate things, but we are together, physical, mental, and spiritual beings. That is how we depict the Trinity, right? In Trinitarian theology, you have Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, but they're not like three different separate parts, right? They're three aspects of the same reality, and it's the same for us. So when we talk about God influencing spiritually, God having a formative effect on physical matter, it's not, two different things completely separated. There's like a void that God has to somehow traverse, right? That there's like this space, like we have our physical bodies, and there's some kind of a borderline where God has to come in and through some kind of magic, right, has some kind of an effect there. If we are, in effect, spiritual in nature in our physical selves, then our physical selves can be duly affected in that way. Admittedly, a challenging concept to try to wrap your mind around. However, the doctrine, or I guess I should say that the perspective of panentheism is rather helpful in that. Now, panentheism, not pantheism. Pantheism is God is the world. Gaia, or as it's more commonly referred to now, Gaia 2.0, the new Gaia theory. It's not that. Panentheism is God in and through all of creation. So, truly understanding God as pervasively present in all of creation, in and through everything. So that there's not a place where God does not exist, including in our physical selves. So that God may influence in a causative manner through physical, through non-reductive physicalism. Now, this is where my scientifically minded sisters and brothers have the most challenge, because science by its very nature is reductive, right? The idea is to break things down into smallest component parts so we can explain things. But as I mentioned, the universe as we know it now, thanks to investigations in the quantum realm, I'm not talking about Ant-Man, I'm not talking about real quantum physics, but the universe is far more open than we had previously thought. So the idea of causative action is indeed a possibility. in reaction to the idea of quantum physics. I think Einstein once said, your math is correct, but your physics are abominable, because it is a difficult thing to try to wrap your mind around. That is where theology comes in. That is where theology comes to the rescue. We can start with science and end with theology. Start with science as the base point, right? Understanding all of physical reality in the way that it is, right? And then trying to determine how that influence from a spiritual matter happens, right? We have non-reductive physical systems in which the spirit can work in and through. So we are created by God to receive spiritual information, to receive spiritual guidance, to receive spiritual movements in and through our physical selves, so that the spirit is then recognized in the physical world. So the progress of ourselves moves forward. And again, in Western traditions, this is difficult to try to wrap our minds around. But if you look at, as I said, Neo-Confucian Chi cosmology, because prior to Neo-Confucianism, and Confucianism is a little difficult. You have Confucianism, and you have Neo-Confucianism, and you have New Confucianism, even though Neo and New, it's the same word, but they're different phases of Confucian thought, where we move from purely philosophical to a religio-philosophic tradition as they engage in the cosmology and the understanding of the formation of the universe. In Neo-Confucian cosmology, there is order. Li Shu, which is the eternal Li, which is the eternal orderly cosmic principle. This idea that there is a cosmic order to things, that things happen in just such a way. Taoist cosmology also has the understanding of the way, right? The eternal, unknowable way. But in Taoist cosmology, the universe begins in a state of Hundun, which is chaos. It's a chaotic beginning of just everywhere, right? So if you combine those two views, Neo-Confucian Chi cosmology and Taoist cosmology, with the idea of the way and the eternally orderly cosmic principle, then you have Chi flowing in and through the entirety of the universe in a physical and non-physical manner, so it can influence and offer information in systems from the top down, bottom up, back and forth in a feedback loop. So if we look at the Holy Spirit of God acting in and through humanity in such a way, then we can understand how the physical can be influenced by the spiritual, and they can exist together, convergent in the same time. Okay, admittedly, I got through that pretty quickly. There's a lot of big concepts in there, and I do have a few articles written, which they're governed by publication rights, so I can't necessarily share all that information on my own channel. That's the problem with publishing. You have to kind of give away your rights to it. But there's a great deal of information out there. If you'd like further reading on that, by all means, shoot me a note in the comments, and I can share some of the publication information with you. Or by all means, research it on your own. But as I mentioned, my Francis Clooney quote, right? We can better understand our own tradition in light of someone else's. Sometimes we have to step out of our own comfort zone and take a step over here and say, okay, let me examine spiritual action. Let me examine divine action. Let me examine the possibility of divine action in the world and the formation of humanity and the human body through the lens of another tradition. Not stepping out of my own tradition, but kind of taking that Confucian Taoist lens and saying, hey, through this lens, I can understand how that would happen. Because we can analyze these processes, and we can have a better understanding of the formation of humanity and the cosmos in a spiritually integrated manner. Which then leads us to the spiritual questions of, well, what does salvation mean? Which we'll get to in our next video on soteriology. So until next time, have a great week, and as always, happy reading.